Okay. I'm gonna start in a big crowd.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. This is Tom Vogel. Oh, you're gonna move that. Okay. I'm Tom Vogel, and this is Curious About Cannabis. This is not your grandparents' cannabis necessarily. I teach cannabis here at Spoon and at the Outreach Center, and I can tell you after 3 years of doing this, I can very easily divide my class into 3 groups. Okay, I've got the group of 60, 70, 80, 90-year-olds that take it because when you get to our age, you've got everything that hurts and you're tired of big pharma killing your kidneys and liver and stuff. So they're looking for an alternative. And then I've got that group that's younger, your age, that is looking to get into the business of cannabis with Nature's Grace and Wellness, high THC, or Stony Branch, high CBD, and they need to get some background before they can make themselves valuable to the industry. And then I've got that group in the middle. We'll call them the transition people. They're 30s, 40s, 50s, and they just want to grow better, homegrown for whatever ailment they've got. Okay, so that's what Spoon is all about. We've got a wonderful partnership with a number of different groups that are helping. If you don't know anything about cannabis, that's a great place to start. Okay, cannabis has been around. This is cannabis, by the way. This little girl is a chocolate cherry cheesecake. Okay, she's about 8 weeks old, and she's just getting close to the point where I would push her into flower if I were going to finish her off. She is atypical because if you look, you'll see that she's got tri-lobe leaves instead of 5 or even 7. Some cultivars have as many as 9. That's not a problem. It's just like all of us, there's a lot of variability in shapes and sizes and colors, and that's not a problem. It's just there's a lot of different cultivars out there. Okay, so this is chocolate cherry cheesecake, and when we look at these have been around from Asia forever. I mean, this may have been one of the very first domesticated plants, the beginning of agriculture, before corn, before rice, before wheat, cannabis. And primarily what we believe that early cultivars were used for was fiber. Okay, I know I'm way overdressed today, but I thought I could sneak it in one more day. This is a hemp shirt. And World War I, all of the uniforms were made of hemp because it's more durable than cotton. It doesn't chafe, it's warm, it lasts forever. It's kind of like Carhartt, if you're familiar with Carhartts. It's nearly bulletproof, you know, it's phenomenal. And all the uniforms were made of that in World War I. So this was a big industry, right? Lots and lots of fiber. And although there is evidence that people were using the seeds for food and the flower for medicinal and recreational use, primarily it was a cannabis hemp industry, right? You see a lot of names, and I put some handouts here for you. You see a lot of name changes. Depending on if I'm talking to cannabis people or science people, the terminology changes completely. Okay, if I'm talking to agricultural people, this is hemp. Hemp is kind of an arbitrary term that was used by the Illinois Department of Ag and the United States Department of Ag. The idea here was we want to make sure that you know that's not marijuana. It's marijuana. Sorry. It's the same plant, right? It's cannabis sativa, it's the same plant, but they were really struggling to make sure that there was a distinction, a definition of this is not going to get you high. That is not going to get you high. That's going to make you reduced anxiety and pain, but it's not going to get you high. Okay, so hemp is this new arbitrary term. It means that it has less than 0.3% delta-9 THC. 0.3%, again, an arbitrary term that goes back to the 40s, and then doing the research goes back to the early teens. And of course, the chemistry back then was lousy, the science back then was lousy. This is just a random number that was pulled out of a hat, but it's tradition, so we're going to keep using it. It's not a matter of if this is 3%, you're going to get high, or 0.5%, you're going to get high. It's just an arbitrary term that's where they decided anything higher than that is going to be considered marijuana. Anything lower than that is going to be considered hemp. Okay, so there's different licenses depending on which one you're going to grow, which one you're going to process, which one you're going to sell or use, lots of differences. So when the colonies first were started in the United States, it was mandatory that all farmers had to grow hemp. Not a, you can if you want to, you have to. That's how much hemp was needed in this new economy. So when we look at the stem itself, this is a stem of a cannabis plant right here. And what we're seeing is the outside of that is called the bast. It's very soft, very flexible, very long fibers. That's what we make textiles out of. So shirts, probably not old enough, but when I was a kid, we had canvas shoes. And canvas shoes were made out of cannabis. That's where the canva comes from. So if you had a canvas tent, it was out of cannabis. And that was the fiber that they used, these bast fibers here. Very tough, very durable, very strong, and incredibly long lasting. Okay? Inside of that, we find the hurd. The hurd is hard. It's full of cellulose. It's very woody. And the hurd is used for paper production. Okay? We can make paper out of it. We can make plastics out of it. We can make all kinds of things out of that. That's the inside part. We can also use this for animal bedding. Like if you've got hamsters, instead of using wood chips or that kind of things for small mammals, we use that for that. Okay, so lots of fiber, and we were talking about fiber. For me, I see this as the big future of cannabis moving forward in the United States. THC, CBD, these are incredibly important medicines, and we're going to see those forever. But this is really the untapped market in cannabis. When we look at the natural fibers and the durability of these fibers, the problem is chicken and the egg. I want to process cannabis. Great. Build a $5 million plant. Great. Now I can process cannabis. And now all the farmers near me know that I've got a factory where they can bring their leftover stems. We can grind those. We can make fiber, whatever. But you have to have the processor first. Otherwise, all the people that are growing cannabis in the state currently, almost all of that goes into landfill, ditches. There's just nobody close enough. For me to sell stems, that processing plant has to be within 100 miles. If I have to truck it more than 100 miles, I've not broke even. So what's the point, right? But more and more we're going to see those processing plants pop up in Illinois, and then all the people around those processing plants are going to actually have a place to convert that stem into fiber. So that's a big, big future. Now, as you can see, Boston Harbor 1700, there was a big call for fiber. Transportation required sailing ships. That means we've got sails. That means we've got cordage, all the ropes, everything. This is Boston Harbor in 1700. And you can see the need for those new colonies to produce more and more fiber to keep their ships afloat, to keep transportation afloat. Well, fast forward just a couple hundred years, you can see that, well, there's no market. We've lost that sailing industry, and therefore we've lost a big part of the market. I tell you this because there's a tremendous amount of conspiracy about why THC, CBD, cannabis, all of this was criminalized back in the 20s. And there's lots of conspiracies, there's lots of theories, there's lots of evidence for all of those. But the reality is the market had just dried up. So if all of those were false, cannabis still would have stopped being a commercial product in the United States simply because there was no local market for it. Okay? When we talk about cannabis now, when I started teaching this 5 years ago, I would refer to 153 cannabinoids that have been identified. Cannabinoids are the phytomolecules, the plant-based molecules produced by the plant. And so many of these in all plants, we've found a purpose, right? Over 6 million years of man being on the planet, we've identified, hey, this rice is good for this purpose, and this corn is good for this purpose. We've learned these things. Well, they also learned that the chemicals produced by the plant aren't produced for us, they're produced for the plant for a number of different reasons. Anti-herbivory is a big one. For example, with pine, everybody is familiar with the smell of pine, the texture of pine, the stickiness of pine, and if you get it on your fingers and then taste it, it's like, boy, that's really bad. That's anti-herbivory. The pine produces this cannabinoid, alpha-pinene, which gives it that taste, flavor, and smell. So those oils are there to prevent herbivory of that plant. Virtually nothing big on the planet still consumes pine because that's how good it is. We can use pine needles for pesticides and herbicides and all kinds of things. You can put them in your flower garden to keep the weeds out. That's a cannabinoid. These cannabinoids, 153. Now it's over 200. And the reason they found over 200 is because now it's legal in the United States to openly do the research, and just bucket loads, a plethora of new research is being done in the States, and we're finding all kinds of new stuff. So we've got over 200 of them. It was for a very long time believed that we had 2 receptor sites in our body, CB1, CB2 receptor sites. That means that I actually have on my neurons receptors that match perfectly to these cannabinoids. Okay? That means that we have co-evolved. We've evolved these receptors, and these fit here. It's not just cannabis that does that, right? Any food we eat because when we eat it, we've got a natural receptor, and that natural receptor breaks down that food, and now we can get some value from it, whether it's flavor or nutrition. We can get some value from it. That's coevolution. Okay? So we've got 200 plus different molecules that can be identified by the plant. And we've got not CB1 and CB2, but I told you we've got lots of new research going on. We've got more receptor sites being found all the time. In fact, the first ones that were found were kind of out there on the edge, and they didn't want to name them because they're like, couldn't this be true? So they named them non-CB1 and non-CB2. They will be CB3 and CB4, but right now it's like, well, I don't know if I want to do that. On top of that, the research has gone to the point where we now know that there are actually 21 different receptor sites on our cells to pick up those phytomolecules. It gives you more and more of an idea just how coevolution works and how closely bonded the mammalian body is, not just humans, the mammalian body, because all mammals have this endocannabinoid system. Your dog, your cat, all mammals have it. So all of them are capable of responding directly to these molecules. Typically when we talk about CB1, this is in your brain and spinal cord, central nervous system. So you're talking about, this is where the head high comes in. This is where the euphoria comes in. This is where the anti-anxiety comes in. The CB1, CB2 receptor sites. CB2 receptor sites are more somatic, they're your body. So this is the pain relief in the CB2, okay? Very, very closely linked to CBD, much more closely linked to THC, the two phytocannabinoids that you're most commonly hearing, okay? Now, a couple of things you have to understand is with cannabis, we're looking at a threshold level, right? A threshold level is if you're a hunter and you've got a gun and you pull the trigger. I can pull a little bit on the trigger and it doesn't fire. I pull enough on the trigger, I hit that threshold level, and then it's all or nothing, right? It's not partially fired. So the sub-threshold level means you can consume cannabinoids below that threshold level, and your CB1 receptor sites are never going to kick in. But your CB2 receptor sites may have a lower threshold level, so they do fire. Case in point, little experiment for you. Think about your favorite food in the world. I'm serious, this is homework, so think about it right now. Thinking about your favorite food? Check the inside of your mouth. Full of spit? Sub-threshold. Now, imagine if whatever your favorite food was, I actually have it behind the desk, and now here's your favorite food. Threshold level, right? Thinking about it, smelling it, talking about it, hearing about it is great, but it's below the threshold level. To really hit that optimum level, I have to hit the threshold level. I have to actually consume lobster for lunch. So you get the idea, right? Threshold level, sub-threshold level. CB2 primarily is and many of these are CBD, CB1, THC. Oh, I hit the wrong button. Okay, so when we talk about cannabis, we often hear different levels of cannabis, like recreational or medical, criminalized or decriminalized. They talk about it's the same plant. It's simply a matter of what your primary function is. And I would argue the fact that all recreational cannabis is still medical cannabis. You're introducing these cannabinoids into your body to elicit a biological effect. Your body is going to feel differently, like when you eat. right? You feel better after you eat, right? You have certain foods that I eat chocolate and I just can't eat, not me personally, caramel for me, but my wife, if she has a chance to eat chocolate, she's gonna be happier, right? It just makes her feel better. Again, that's that coevolution. We've got those receptor sites. So medical or recreational really is probably the same thing. It's just how much you're going to take and when you're going to take it, how often you're going to take it. THC, again, is that break point between hemp, CBD cannabis, and high THC cannabis. 0.3% is the level. Back when I was a kid, 1969, when I was first introduced to cannabis, we were lucky to find cultivars that were 4 or 5% THC. Really, I mean, that's just what the market was. Almost all of the cannabis in the country at that time was coming from Mexico, and this was not high quality cannabis, but it had been grown in Mexico for hundreds of years and had maintained pretty much a constant level. Now we're looking at cannabis that is often in the high 20%, right? So it's very, very different. Plus, I'll get into this very quickly. There's no lethal dose of cannabis like there is for alcohol or opioids or things like that. But I am greatly concerned with all the concentrates we're making these days. We're getting really high concentrate levels, sometimes in the 80-90% THC. The problem here is still you can't die from it. We have no receptor sites in our brainstem for cannabis. And because we don't have where the breathing and heart rate receptors are, those centers for cardiac and respiratory, we don't have any of those receptors there. Like alcohol blocks those receptors and you can actually die from alcohol consumption. Can't do that with cannabis, but it does have the potential for, automobile accidents and slip and falls and things like that. So this is really becoming more problematic in the industry as concentrations are getting so high. So when the decriminalization happened in in Illinois, there was a great question for, well, if this is going to be decriminalized, why was it criminalized in the first place? Is there something our grandparents knew that we don't know? Is there something we know they didn't know? So we have to really go back to the FBN, Federal Bureau of Narcotics. This was not the first attempt to save people from themselves, right? You've all heard of Prohibition. Prohibition was a very divisive time in the United States where we had people that were absolutely for it and people that were absolutely against it. And Prohibition, there was a great deal of propaganda before the vote, trying to sway you to either side, trying to sway Congress to either side of this debate. And one of the things that came out at that time was this evolution of the drunkard. Sure, it's all fine and good. You have a sip, you're social, but you're going to end up killing yourself or others. I mean, that just is always going to happen with alcohol. Okay, Prohibition worked. Prohibition with the 18th Amendment and no alcohol in the country. Crimes went down, divorces went down, battery went down. It worked. It was awesome. This would have been great. Cannabis was classified as a Schedule I narcotic. Definition of a Schedule I narcotic, two things. As high incident of addiction. Number two, no medical use. I just described alcohol. High level of addiction, no medical use. And it was alcohol. And guess what? It's not really a guess, because you know what happened. What happened was, how's it all going? 13 years later, Congress said, what the hell did we do? We just outlawed our drug. That's crazy. Keep in mind, Congress at the time, nearly 80% of Congress was openly members of the Ku Klux Klan. So it's not a matter of, gee, who are we going to pick on? Pretty obviously, everybody but us, right? So Congress is all these old white guys, and old white guys loved alcohol and tobacco. Those were their drugs. So when we look at these, the downside of criminalizing it then, this was just, okay, the FBN says They're the new organization, right? And if you're a new organization in the government, you have to identify that there's a purpose for me. You need me. So the FBN was really struggling. Uh-oh, prohibition's been repealed. We got to go after somebody. And what they knew was we got to go after somebody that's not in Congress because we got to pick on somebody else. So one more conspiracy piece of that puzzle. Reefer Madness. Awesome. Reefer Madness comes out and lets the country know who most people in America had never heard of cannabis. They had no idea, right? It's the 30s. Nobody knew about it. So Reefer Madness was kind of that non-PSA. It's not the political, it wasn't produced by the politicians. It was produced by individuals trying to spread the word that this, like alcohol, will cause you to murder and die. So this is going to be bad. We don't want this to happen. Reefer Madness now has a great cult following. You can probably live stream it on Netflix or something, but it brought about the Tax Act of 37, which in essence criminalized cannabis in the United States. From then, it's now taken not 13 years like alcohol, but over 100 years for it to work itself back through the system. We've got better science now, we've got better chemistry. We understand what's going on. It was not always believed to be the devil that it had for so long. In fact, War on Drugs, 70, the Controlled Substance Act, we had the Schaefer Act come out in 72, and the Schaefer Act said, why is this a Schedule I drug? There's no reason for this to be a Schedule I drug. It's fine. It should be, like alcohol. It should be a misdemeanor. If somebody's using it underage, it should be. And this is, of course, during the Watergate years and Nixon, and let's ignore that Schaefer report altogether. So it took another 20 years before the Compassionate Care Act, 1996 in California, and California really stepped up because much of the funding for schools or anything in the state is federal funding. This was not federally legal, and California said, at this point, we don't care. We're risking losing all of our federal funding because this is so ridiculous that it's been illegal, right? And then the other states were like, well, they didn't lose their federal funding. Let's let them try it and see what happens. They didn't lose their federal funding, and so now we've got 38 states that it's legal. We've got 19 states where it's recreational. We've got a number of states that are right on the line, borderline, and we've got a couple of states that have said, no, ever. Never going to happen, not going to happen. We don't need that tax money, and we certainly aren't going to sell our children down that dirty path of the devil's lettuce kind of thing. So this is where we are, going to change. The big pushback on federal regulation now is really the state growers. The state growers don't want it to be federally legalized. Think about it. In Illinois, we've got a few growers growing a lot of cannabis, but in Oregon, they've got 7 years of surplus cannabis sitting in fiber drums. They grew so much, so fast, and they can only sell it in their state as well. And there's only so many people in Oregon. So they've got a lot more weed than they've got people, and they're just hoping that it goes federally legal, because then they can ship it to every state in the union. If you buy a joint in California or Colorado, it may cost you $1. It's never going to be that cheap here because we don't have that surplus, right? But if they federally legalize it, now the growers in Illinois are going to be really stuck between a rock and a hard place because supply and demand. We've been supplying our whole demand, and now that supply can come from all over the world. They're the ones that are fighting back right now. They're trying to keep it from becoming federally legal. So again, I'm running out of time because this is, I'm already late. I took my typical 2-hour presentation and tried to cut it down into 20 minutes. Guess what? I didn't do it. I tried. Questions? Concerns? I gave you my business card. I am probably the only person you know that answers my phone when I don't recognize the number. And the reason is I give my card out to everybody because so many people have questions and there's still so much negative stigma of talking about it. I often have people that are like, well, I'm dying to ask, but I don't want anybody to know I'm dying to ask, so I get calls later. Please use that. As you need, I will answer any questions you have. I'll do whatever I can to help you understand this product, okay?
That plant right there, you said it's 8 weeks
Yes.
from what?
Seed.
From seed to that in 8 weeks.
Typical growing season is about 16. So I can go, as long as I keep her in long days, like 16 hours, 18 hours of sunlight, she'll never flower. And because I use her for demonstrations, I don't want her to flower. But even while she's in veg like this, she's got a pretty strong aroma. I mean, riding in my Jeep with the windows up, it was like, oh, she's so pretty. From flower, about 8 weeks after that, and you've reached maximum CBD or THC output. So, and that's another thing, you know, male flower versus female flower. The male is going to be very small, very thin, very fragile, gracile body, and have short life expectancy because he has one purpose: pollen sacs. Produces pollen, releases pollen, he dies. She's going to be in the field a lot longer. She's going to collect that pollen. There's the stigma, those long amber structures. She's going to collect pollen on the stigma. Pollen fertilizes her eggs, they become seeds, she's done. So you don't want any males in the garden because they will pollinate the females and ruin their production. You got to keep them all dating, where they're going to get their hair just right and their makeup just right and their clothes are just right, still trying to attract pollen. But once they have attracted pollen, it's flannels and sweatpants, right? It's not that I'm speaking from experience, but I'm speaking from experience. That's the female flower.
How much product does a single plant create, Tom?
Depending on if you're growing indoors or outdoors, how big you let them get. Often you're limited by space, so maybe 10, 12 ounces,
Okay.
up to people that will grow them outside into trees might get 7 pounds off a single plant. Okay, we don't grow 7-pound plants in Illinois simply because our growing season's short, but in other states, you'll be able to download pictures online where they actually are growing these monstrous trees and you have to brace them all up and everything, and you might get several pounds off one plant. In Colorado, an ounce is going to be about 200, while it's 800 to 1200 here, just because of the supply and demand thing. And getting Colorado plants here, or Oregon plants here, or California plants here would completely destroy the Illinois market.
So
And I
if
have
you're
a-
wanting to do a processing plant, like for the fiber and things, you'd want to do it in the south where the growing season was longer, because you could get bigger quantities and bigger fiber. Out of, because you could, literally down there, then you could take this, use it for whatever, the leaves and all of that, and once you guys use the stem for,
Right.
so the whole root, the whole plant is being used then.
Absolutely. I think you've got that in one of your handouts. I didn't make that cut. So yeah, the idea is, you know, you could grow just fiber plants. Fiber plants aren't bushy like her. They're tall and spindly. It looks like cypress garden, right? Long, tall stems might be 14 feet tall, and then you've just got this much veg up on the top. You're going to come along with a combine that's got 2 cutters on it. Cutter at the top cuts this off, and then a cutter at the bottom cuts the stem, and then you can ret the stems, leave them in the field. They will start to break down, and then you can bundle those stems up. But there's nobody growing fiber for fiber because there's no place close enough to process it. So the stems that are being produced in the CBD and THC market right now are just waste.
Interesting.
Does this the part of the country we live in, obviously the soil is better from what I understand for growing. Does that affect does that affect, and how does it affect like growing?
Illinois
here versus,
has
like, other places?
the potential for the best cannabis in the world for that very reason. When we look at the volume of topsoil we've got here, sometimes it's up to 4 feet. In Oregon, sometimes you're talking about 15 inches, right? So better soil, better farmers. I mean, people in Illinois have been farming for generations, so they know how to do it. They really have the potential to destroy the market for these marginal places that have been growing mediocre cannabis for so long. It's simply a matter of, I work with a number of farmers as a consultant, and there's still that, I just don't want anybody to know that I'm growing this. Right? One sweet little old lady that I had in class, she remembers having cannabis on her dad's farm when she was a kid. When World War II was firing up, the government legalized cannabis because they were like, World War I, we had cannabis for hemp uniforms. Now, the hemp that's coming into the United States is coming from the Philippines, which now is being taken over by Japan. They're not going to sell it to us to fight them. So they legalized cannabis, and the problem was the farmers had already gotten rid of all their cannabis equipment. They're like, well, I'm not going to go out and buy all that equipment again. You told me no. I said no. So very few people got back on board. Few people did that still had the stuff, behind the barn. Few people got back on board and grew it, but it was never enough to actually help the war effort. Thanks, folks.